I have a dream.
If you found out, allegedly, that Martin Luther King Jr. was involved in some wild, freaky that seems like every other you know.
That my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Would it change how you see him?
Nope.
No.
Not at all.
He got hit in the head with a rock. Nigga singing We Shall Overcome.
I have a dream today.
They don't get any better. He said he deserves some yeah, he deserves whatever he wants. He fought for us.
The moral leader of our nation.
Our leader, Dr. King.
Our leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Dr. King was our leader.
It's he who controls the narrative of the past, controls the policies of the present, and the conditions of the future.
Gas, rubber bullets, mostly peaceful protests.
If Dr. King was about judging people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin, should we judge King by the content of his character?
Dr. King, it's been alleged that you have been slow to sever your ties with alleged communists.
Stanley Lepson, yeah, he's always in his ear.
I mean, he wrote everything that MLK said publicly.
Always in his ear.
He rejected the deity of Christ, the resurrection, the virgin birth. He rejected a literal hell.
Can we trust someone that appears to be faithful to a movement, but he's not faithful to his family?
King's relationship with the fundamental gospel of the Bible is absolutely non-existent.
Martin Luther King is the founding father for the kind of shifting, if you will, into America 2.0. And my question for anybody is, are we better for it? My hope is that we leave here not with answers or just answers, but also with questions as well. Questions that cause us to go deeper into the Word of God, deeper into our faith, and deeper into history. I'm here to talk to you all about the social justice gospel in the church. Now, what is the social justice gospel? I'm sure many of you have heard the term the social gospel and social justice. So what is the social justice gospel? Well, social justice is a word that's used primarily by what we call woke or secular activists, Marxist activists. The social gospel is basically social justice, but with a Christian tinge. It's a counterfeit gospel. And as the Apostle Paul said, anyone who teaches a counterfeit gospel, let them be accursed. Dr. Martin Luther King was a proponent of the social gospel. He was a proponent of Babel and not Bible. Now, what do I mean by Babel and not Bible? Well, as we all know, during the days of the Tower of Babel, many biblical historians believe that the ruler Nimrod commissioned the building of this tower that will extend into the heavens. And the objective was to build utopia, to build basically a shrine to their greatness and to usurp the position of God. And God confused the languages, and man dispersed across the earth and built nations. But this wasn't the end, because Christ will later come and give us the only way to unify, the only means to get to heaven, not by building a tower, but rather by first descending, by putting on flesh, by living a perfect life, by preaching a perfect message, by dying for our sins, by raising from the dead, and by ascending. And in his ascension, he invites those of us who are willing to repent and to trust in him, that we might share with him in paradise. We cannot build our own societal Tower of Babels by way of politics or any other means. We can't build utopia on earth, but we are given a commission to go into the ends of the earth and to baptize in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and to be exemplars of the gospel. We can't do it any other way. So before I get too heavy into the social justice gospel, I would like to first give a quick history lesson, if I may. So As you all have just seen, I'm in the midst of, well, actually the latter parts of creating a docu-series. It's not a documentary, it's a docu-series called the MLK Project. And the goal is to basically get to the bottom of what was actually going on during the civil rights era, and what Martin Luther King was actually trying to do, which is quite different than what many of us have been taught in our public schools. And you can't tell this story by just jumping right into the mid 50s when they were doing the Montgomery bus boycott. You have to go back further than that. You already mentioned the Tower of Babel earlier. But in this docuseries, we start actually with the Revolutionary War. And we start with the days when they were trying to figure out what kind of country will we be. As an independent historian, I think a lot about nation building and what was going through the heads of the founding fathers when they took the commission to build America. Contrary to what a lot of people believe, especially what I believe growing up, going to public school, the founding fathers were not on one accord. There was a very bitter debate going on. You had on one side the so-called Federalists, led by the likes of Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison. And on the other side, you had men that we don't often hear about. Men like Luther Martin, men like Patrick Henry, and others. And those anti-federalists were very concerned about something that they saw at play. You see, we just won our independence from an oppressive monarchical government. And we had the opportunity to set our own destiny, as it were. And what the anti-federalists understood is that you have a diversity of people living in the colonies. You had the Quakers, you had the Puritans, you had the Anglicans, you had the Episcopalians. You had all these different diverse groups of people, and most of the time they were at each other's throat. And so what the problem that the anti-federalists foresaw is that you can't possibly call upon all these diverse groups of people and build one nation, because to do so will be akin to building a Tower of Babel. When you look at the writings, like in the Brutus papers or in the anti-federalist papers, and you read the debates, you see this kind of imagery of building a Tower of Babel. And they were afraid of potential demagoguery coming in, people taking advantage of, exploiting public opinion. And they were concerned that we will build the same kind of tyranny that we just won our independence from. And so as a result of this, by a lot of pressure coming from the anti-federalists, the compromise was that we will have what was called a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was meant to limit the reach of the federal government. And so even though we got a ratified constitution, the score was not exactly settled. There was still this attempt to build this large, overarching, ever-powerful federal government. Around 60 years after the ratification of the Constitution, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels would publish their book, The Communist Manifesto. And a lot of politicians here in the United States took a liking to this man, Karl Marx, who is writing for the New York Daily Tribune. He was writing about workers' grievances and revolution. And a lot of what we call radical Republicans in office took a liking to this Karl Marx, including Abraham Lincoln, who shared some correspondence with Karl Marx. Slavery existed in America. It existed in several southern states. And they were threatening to secede from the Union, not because of slavery, but because of states' rights, because they were still bitter about how the Constitution was ratified on the first part, but also the fact that you saw these kind of maneuvers that were being made since the ratification of the northern states imposing their will all the more on the southern states. They were threatening on multiple occasions to secede from the Union. And after the election of Abraham Lincoln, in order to try to come up with another compromise, there was something called the Kirwan Amendment. And what the Kirwan Amendment proposed was that, look, you in the southern states, you get to keep your slaves, but we can't allow slavery to extend to other states. The South, by and large, rejected the Kirwan Amendment because for them, it wasn't about slavery. It was about states' rights. In fact, after they seceded from the Union, Jefferson Davis would become the president of the Confederacy. And if you look at his writings, and if you look at the writings of Robert E. Lee, you'll find that they didn't believe that slavery should exist in perpetuity. They believed that the South should have the right to end slavery in the same fashion as the North. When you look at the slave narratives that exist, and you understand that slavery existed for the better part of human history and still exists to this very day, and that industrialization was beginning to change the way that economics is done. And when you look at, again, the slave narratives and realize that the life of the slave on the plantation was not, by and large, this kind of rough thing where you were being beaten across the back every day. I know that's outrageous to hear, but it's just true. Is this an advocacy for slavery? No, it's not. But I think when it comes to history, we have to deal with the facts as they are and not deal with narratives that are basically just revisionist history that is meant to control policy right now and into the future, because that is, after all, what the purpose of a lot of the history that we're taught in our schools are. So after the end of slavery, you had something called Reconstruction. Now, Reconstruction is interesting because today the narrative, the prevailing narrative amongst Black culture is that Reconstruction was necessary because we needed our reparations, we needed this, we needed that, and we needed the third to get on our feet. And what's interesting about that is there were a lot of reparations that were dished out in the private sector. You had a lot of slaves who wanted to stay in proximity to their masters. And you had a lot of slave masters who set up their slaves with money and with land and with cattle and things of this nature. And it was different for each family. It was different for each situation. I know in my own family, we currently have 150 acres of land in Arkansas that was given to us after slavery. And so, what am I trying to communicate here? In the days that we're now living in, where you have this huge call for reparations coming from a certain contingent of our society, they are leaning on and basing their arguments on a false history or a history that's far more nuanced than they let on. And that's important to know. Again, my hope is that we leave here with more questions than answers. The Reconstruction period was the first civil rights movement. And what it was the Union coming down to the South by way of carpetbaggery and the use of scalawags, imposing their will on the South. Not treating the South not like co-equal sovereign entities, but as conquered territory, conquered men. When you look at the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendment, the fact is a lot of Southerners were disenfranchised and unable to give their opinion into whether or not those amendments should be passed. Again, these are the facts. The reality of it is, when you look at the civil rights era, and you look at the fact that Marx and Engels were in correspondence with some of our very own politicians in Congress, you'll see that the idea of slavery was exploited for the purpose of furthering the cause for the proletarian revolution in America. There's a book that I recommend you all read. It's called Letters to Americans. And what it is a book of correspondence between Marx, Engels, and American Union generals and American politicians. And what this book consists of is strategy on how the North can best the South, and to use the slave and the grievance of the slave as an exploitative thing to really push and impose their will in the building up of the federal government. Now, is that to say that the Civil War had only to do with Marxism? Absolutely not. There were a lot of noble Christian abolitionists who partook in the fight against slavery, and that must not go unrecognized. As you move into the 1930s, as FDR is the president of the United States, he set forth a commission, and this commission was tasked with how to deal with the issues of the Negro. And the commission started something called the National Negro Congress. And the National Negro Congress was a preeminent civil rights movement of the 1930s. And at its head was a man by the name of A. Philip Randolph. Now, the National Negro Congress was started with the help of Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. So you had the feds and you had the communists who had a hand in starting the civil rights movement. Civil rights movement wasn't started as an organic grassroots thing. It was started in a nefarious fashion. The feds had an interest in using the civil rights movement as a means of agitating in the streets, the objective being to make local communities and states look incapable of self-governance. The idea being that if you can agitate the people, if you can cause riots and unrest, what that will then do is create a public outcry for federal response. And in so doing, you expand the role of the federal government, and you basically usurp states' rights, because that's what it's always been about. The communists, although they use the same tactic, had a very different goal. Their goal was to use the civil rights movement to usher in Marxism into the United States and into the West at large by way of the Negro. The National Negro Congress set forth little brother and little sister groups. One was called the Southern Negro Youth League, or the Southern Negro Youth Conference, actually. They set up shop in Alabama, and they would often put on events and social gatherings for the youth with the objective of recruiting them to the communist cause. In the 1920s, 1920 to be exact, you had something called the Second Congress of the Communist International in Moscow. One of the American delegates was an American journalist by the name of John Reed. He went to this convention, and when it was his turn to speak, he spoke of the Negro problem in America. And they were frustrated that communism is not taking root in the United States. What must we do? And the solution, according to John Reed, was that he basically said the American Negro does not have political conscience. We need to raise a political conscience. 5 years prior, a man by the name of Booker T. Washington passed away. And what's interesting about Booker T. Washington is that in the aftermath of the friction and the tension between Negroes and whites in the South, and the tension as a result of the Civil War, where you had the loss of brothers and fathers and sons, you had friction, you had tension, and a lot of it was being flamed by the federal government. Again, all this is verifiable. How must we learn to break down these barriers and come along and get together? Well, Booker T. Washington delivered a speech in Atlanta, and he gave such a good speech that he had a standing ovation from both blacks and whites who were in the audience. And he said something that was interesting. He said, "We must cast down our bucket where we are, regardless of where you are and who you are. The idea and the objective should be to focus on your craft, Focus on building families. Focus on becoming the best version of yourself. To put God first. It's a really good speech. I recommend everyone goes and look at it. It's called the Atlanta Exposition Speech. And the idea was that, blacks, whites, whoever you are, focus on your families, focus on your communities, focus on building businesses. In the space of the free market, ultimately we'll learn to break down race barriers because of basic need. He was the president of Tuskegee, I forget the actual full name of it, but the Tuskegee School in Alabama. And they became masters at building bricks, making bricks. And they had white customers as well as black customers who were buying bricks from Tuskegee. And in that kind of transaction experiment, they were able to learn to kind of break down those race barriers by doing business with each other. From the time Booker T. Washington came onto the scene to 1954, before the Brown v. Board of Education, you saw the repealing of Jim Crow laws at the local and private level. And giving praise where thanks is due, you had the NAACP who were participating and quietly getting rid of a lot of these Jim Crow laws. You had this kind of upward trajectory that was happening. Thomas Sowell documents this in his writings. You had this upward trajectory, this upward mobility that was happening in terms of family formation amongst blacks, in terms of home ownership, in terms of entrepreneurship. It wasn't perfect. There was still poverty. There was still suffering and turmoil, but the same existed for whites too. The same existed for Asians too. The same existed for other ethnic groups as well. And so John Reed tells the convention, we need to raise the political conscience of the Negro. And as a result of this, Vladimir Lenin greenlit this goal of using whatever means necessary to raise the consciousness of the Negro. That was in 1920. Over the course of the 20s, over the course of the next 10 years, you saw all this unrest, all these race riots springing up seemingly out of nowhere. One is what we know today as the Tulsa Race Massacre. I'm sure you've heard of this. This was initiated by a newspaper article, which read, "Nab Negro for attacking girl on elevator." Now, what's interesting about that article is that it was written by a man by the name of Richard Lloyd Jones. Folks, Richard Lloyd Jones is what we call a fellow traveler. You don't have to take my word for it. You can look up his Wikipedia page. He considered himself a progressive. His wife was participating in the cause for Planned Parenthood in the 1920s. You see the fact that he was part of what was called the Unitarian Church, which was a sect, a denomination where communists were often having their communist meetings over the course of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So why would this man, who's supposed to be, and not only that, he considered himself a champion for civil rights. So why would this man write an article, "Nab Negro for attacking girl on elevator"? The idea was friction and tension and getting folks riled up, especially in a time when it was taboo for Negroes and whites to intermarry and to be together in that way. This caused friction. It caused tension. A white mob showed up to the jail where Dick Rowland was, who was the Negro in question. And so too did a black mob. While the white mob was invoked and provoked by the Nab Negro for attacking girl on elevator article, the black mob was similarly provoked by a article written by a black journalist named A.J. Smitherman, who was a member of the NAACP, who was working loosely with the Communist Party. The idea is friction and tension, to get people at each other's throats, to exploit grievances, to cause unrest. A huge brawl broke out, and by the first accounts, A handful of blacks died, a handful of whites died, and the numbers increased over the year. Well, the numbers for the blacks who died increased over the years, while the number of whites who died decreased over the years, depending on who you're asking. For the longest time, it's called the Tulsa Race Riot, but in recent years, we're now calling it the Tulsa Race Massacre. And that's where the story ends, according to our history books. But that's not where the story ends, according to reality. Shortly after this riot broke out, they got to work to rebuild it. In fact, it wasn't called Black Wall Street until after all this happened and transpired. There was a filmmaker by the name of Solomon Sir Jones, who was an amateur filmmaker, amateur videographer. He would go around capturing footage. And if you look at the signboards of a video that he did in 1923, you can see where it says Tulsa, Greenwood District, which is Black Wall Street. And then it's followed by images of Black business owners, of children dancing in the street, of 4th of July parades, of old people eating cake at the local cafe. And if you dig even further into the footage and rewind it to 1922, you'll see that Blacks and whites are actually working together, rebuilding this community. That's the part of history that we don't learn. But what we do learn is about the friction and the tension. In fact, a lot of Black activists today look at the Tulsa Race Massacre and say, that's why capitalism doesn't work for Blacks in America. Because every time we build something, here along comes white folks to burn it down and to tear it up. Friction, tension. So ultimately, the National Negro Congress, the Southern Christian, or the Southern Youth League, or whatever it was called, they have all these acronyms and all these different names. It would put on a lot of religious organizations and events in the South. And these events would be frequented by one Michael King Sr. in the 1930s, in the 1940s. Michael King Sr. would go to Germany in a time shortly before the rise of Hitler, and he was enamored of the 16th century theologian, the reformer, Martin Luther. He bastardized the blueprint laid forth by Martin Luther. Karl Marx would do likewise a couple of decades prior. In fact, I have here Karl Marx said of Martin Luther. I'm sorry, I'm getting my words mixed up here. But Karl Marx said of Martin Luther that Luther shattered faith in authority because he restored the authority of faith. He turned priests into laymen because he turned laymen into priests. He freed man from outer religiosity because he made religiosity the inner man. He freed the body from chains because he enchained the heart. But listen to this. He said, if the Protestant transformation of the German laymen into priests emancipated the lay popes, the lay princes, and the whole of their priestly clique, the philosophical transformation of priestly Germans into men will emancipate the people. But secularization will not stop at the confiscation of church estates. So what is it that Karl Marx is saying? Well, what he's saying is that while Luther took the power away from the corrupt Catholic Church and called upon laymen to take what belongs to them, to take their inheritance as Christians through the Reformation. If Martin Luther was able to do that, if this monk was able to do that, then the philosopher, speaking of himself, Karl Marx, can basically do what Martin Luther did, but in the secularization of the world. In fact, he put his communist philosophy above Christianity. And of course, I can get more into that, but I have to quickly move on because I'm running out of time here. So Michael King Sr. was enamored of this kind of bastardized view of Martin Luther. And he saw what he perceived to be Martin Luther wrestling away authority from the Catholic Church through the Reformation and calling people to get back to true doctrine, sound doctrine through the scriptures. He saw what Martin Luther was doing, and he said, I can do that in America by calling men to embrace the social gospel. And so he came back to America and changed his name to Martin Luther King Sr., and then he changed his son's name to Martin Luther King Jr., because he saw himself and his seed as the one who's going to usher in the social gospel, wrestle away religious authority from the churches and the way things were, and move religion forward to embrace this Marxist idea, otherwise known as the social gospel. Martin Luther King would come of age. He wrote in his papers that whenever he was 12, he shocked his Sunday school class by rejecting the resurrection of Christ. He said that he also rejected the deity of Christ. In his college years, he wrote that he didn't believe in the resurrection. He didn't believe in the deity. He didn't believe that Jesus was born of a virgin. He didn't believe in the literal existence of hell, and he didn't believe in the second coming. But yet he's a Christian pastor. All this is verified in the 7 volumes of the King Papers, which you can get on Google or Amazon, wherever you buy books. He never recanted from these beliefs. In fact, these beliefs would be the basis of his ministry. But what he was enamored of, what he was infatuated by, was Marxism. He wrote to his then girlfriend, later wife, Coretta Scott, that the world that he envisions is one where there's a radical redistribution of wealth, where there's no more wars, there's no more poverty. This is the gospel that I will preach to the world. That's the difference between the social gospel, the social justice gospel, and the gospel that we learn about in the Bible, where the gospel we learn about in the Bible calls man to repent, to take up his cross and follow Christ as an individual. The social gospel calls upon systems to change, calls upon governments to extort tax dollars from the American people or from the people of a given nation, and to use that to undergo a radical redistribution of wealth, which is the kind of thing that King talked about. Now, why did I talk about the founding fathers in the beginning? I'm going to wrap this all up and play a clip for you if I have time. I don't know if I have time. Because when King delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech, he invoked the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And he's talking about the way the founding fathers structured the country and how they issued a promissory note, but the check has bounced and has come back as insufficient funds as far as the Negro is concerned, because the Negro, says King, still is not free. So what is he doing? Is he reaffirming the Constitution? Is he getting back to the edicts of the Constitution? Absolutely not. He's co-opting the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. You see, because the founding fathers, historians that they were, understood full well what Jamestown was about. Jamestown, when these settlers were trying to figure out what kind of community there will be, and they set up for themselves a kind of communist or socialist community. And it didn't work. They stored up all the grain, and they said, each according to their ability to each according to their need. And within the space of 2 years, half the population died. They were eating rats and shoelaces until the famous John Smith, who was a former slave under the Ottoman Empire and was the then governor of Jamestown, scrapped that communist system and implemented a system of private property. And as a result of this, Jamestown bounced back rapidly. The same is true of Plymouth, the Plymouth colony, where they implemented their own kind of socialist system. And Governor William Bradford, scrapping that system, said that by adopting the communal system, we thought we were wiser than God. They scrapped that system, and similarly, Plymouth, the Plymouth colony, bounced back. So students of history that they were, the founding fathers understood this. So they weren't implementing a communist or socialist system when they ratified the Constitution, regardless of if they were Federalists or Anti-Federalists. They sure as heck didn't agree on socialism. So you fast forward to Martin Luther King on that day in 1963, invoking the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, saying that the Negro still is not free. The question then becomes, at least for me, well, how then must the Negro get his freedom? And he was asked this question on a number of occasions. And King said that social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention. He said we must undergo a radical redistribution of economic power. He was arguing for a universal basic income. He was advocating for social justice, and he was advocating for communism. But when asked on a number of occasions, are you a communist or do you have communists in your organization? His answer was always no. He was lying. In fact, the reason that he gave for not being a communist were not even his own words. They were the words of one Robert J. McCracken, who wrote a book in 1951 called Questions People Ask. Reverend Robert J. McCracken. So King lifted the words of Robert J. McCracken, made them his own, and used that as his reason for denying communism, which begs the question, at least for me, if you're going to renounce communism or denounce communism, why not use your own words to do so if you do feel that so strongly about it? But when you look at his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was the brainchild of his handler, Stanley Levison, who was the #1 financier for the Communist Party, who commissioned James Jackson, who was a communist strategist and communist functionary, to staff the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Marxist ministers who infiltrated Catholic and Protestant seminaries and churches as early as the 1930s. You'll begin to realize that King was actually a fraud. And I say that not to be sensational. I say that not to be divisive. I say it because it's true. So what then must we do? Well, we must worship God and not man. That's what we must do. If we want to look to a symbol or a figure of how we must treat each other as men, as brothers, we must look to none other than Christ. He alone has the words of eternal life. It's only the name of Christ that is given to us that we must be saved by. There is no other name. There is no other way. The social gospel won't save. Only the gospel saves. So anyway, I have a little movie that I'm making, a little docu-series that I'm making. It's called the MLK Project, where all this information is available for all. And additionally, I understand a lot of what I'm saying may be hard to take in and consider. But when we release this film, we're also going to be releasing subsequently an index of citations and references on our website where you can go and cross-reference and check the facts on this information. Again, my hope is that we don't leave here with answers, but that we leave here with more questions, and that the hunger of having those questions answered will lead us deeper into our Bibles, deeper into our faith, and deeper into history, because we are called as Christians to test every spirit to see if it's of God. Thank you.
At this time, I have the honor to present to you the moral leader of our nation, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
It was sort of something that you were caught up in a storm. You know, you walked out one day and the wind was blowing and the rain was coming down and everybody around you was talking about the movement. And whether you wanted to or not, you had to pay attention to it. And I did, and got involved.
I watched the civil rights movement because even though I was living in poverty, we had a 2-room shack, At some point, we had electricity and we had a TV. Everyone had a TV.
And so we've come here today to dramatize the shameful condition.
It seemed exciting what was taking place, that these people were on the move, they were on TV, they were changing things. I felt like nothing ever happens around Bedford County, Virginia, and I certainly would have been a part of it if I could have.
To the rural Negro, whose pleasures are few and primitive, there is no greater occasion than Sunday meeting.
Dr. King, was there something peculiar to the place where you started and the kind of people you attracted?
I would say by and large it was very easy to get to the vast majority of Negroes because they were in some way connected with a church in the community.
Martin Luther King Jr., he was groomed, he was a liar, he was a charlatan, he was a menace. And the black community is worse because of it.
King got introduced to us under the guise of deception. He didn't really believe in Christ at all, but he was a pastor.
King's relationship with the fundamental gospel of the Bible is absolutely non-existent.
I happen to feel that God reveals himself in all of the great religions of the world, and there is truth in all. And
he thought a great deal of Hinduism, other world religions, Asian-based religions, but very little from a standpoint of what Christ could do as a result of his life, death, burial, and resurrection.
If we talk about what God does Dr. King believe in, once you've rejected the truth, all that's left is a lie. So if you reject all of that, do you really have the gospel that the Bible teaches about?
Look in your dictionary and see the synonyms of the word black. It's always something degrading and low and sinister. Look at the word white. It's always something pure, high, and clean.
The downfall of blacks has more to do with a mindset shift that was brought about by political rhetoric than anything else.
Afro-American students are openly challenging concepts and practices they encounter. Gone is the timid, please tolerate me attitude of some Negro students of yesteryear.
But you know that many young Negroes don't want anything that smacks of the American white middle class.
Many of the values of white middle class society are values that need to be reviewed and re-evaluated, and in a real sense they need to be changed.
When you feel as though so-called white culture has been foisted upon you as a means by which to control you, well then you see your rebellion against decency as a revolutionary act.
The Christian task is to rebel against all masters, destroying their pretensions to authority and ridiculing the symbols of power.
I think the vast majority of white Americans will go but so far. They are not committed to genuine equality for Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people.
It's clear from his college papers that he was being groomed to become a pastor who would help further the Marxist cause, even though initially King did not want to be a pastor.
Thank you for your presentation. You turned me and my belief in Martin Luther King upside down. I grew up in East St. Louis, Illinois, where I was a minority. And during the time of Martin Luther King talking, I never heard anybody speak against him, that he was a communist or anything. Was he so involved and so dynamic that nobody was wanting to speak against him?
That's a really good question. So yes, the thing about King is, and it's funny because Dr. Carol Swain and I were having a conversation a few weeks ago, and we were actually talking about whether King was a genius or whether it was something else. And the reality of it is, it was something else. King had a photographic memory. He grew up the son of a minister, so he understood oratory skills and cadence and pacing. He understood how to give a really good speech. Not only that, growing up, he was a charmer. He was a very charismatic young man. He considered himself to be the precocious type, is what he called himself. And not only that, uh, he was a really good mimic as well. He could impersonate anybody and sound just like them, according to those who were closest to him. And so the way that I see it, like, if not for a pastor and the leader of the civil rights movement, King would have been an extraordinary actor. I'm talking, John Wayne caliber or Sidney Poitier caliber actor, because he was just that good at selling. And then too, he was a true believer in Marxism, but he understood, after having gone to Crozer Theological Seminary and then subsequently to Boston University, how to mask his Marxist sensibilities through the social gospel, which was popularized at the turn of the 20th century by a so-called theologian by the name of Walter Rauschenbusch, who wrote a book called Christianity and the Social Crisis. After that book was published, they began teaching it in a lot of liberal seminaries. And in fact, if you look at the work of Bella Dodd, she wrote a book called School of Darkness, or if you look at the writings of Fulton Sheen, you can see that the Marxists were hell-bent on infiltrating the institutions, infiltrating the seminaries and the churches for the purpose of taking what they saw as a captive audience in the church, and bastardizing the message in such a way that you're employing and mobilizing the body for the purpose of building with Christian hands this kind of Tower of Babel 2.0, if that makes sense. And so that's my long, whimsical way of answering your question. That it was the thing about it is that King was helped a lot by and aided a lot by the press at the time. And the press made it their duty to make King look larger than life. It's interesting because there's a man by the name of Joseph H. Jackson, who was more popular than King in the 1960s. Joseph H. Jackson was the president of what was called the National Baptist Convention. The National Baptist Convention boasted around 5 million Black churchgoers. And Joseph H. Jackson came from the kind of Booker T. Washington-esque school of thought. And you can see evidence of this, for example, when a bunch of Negro sharecroppers who were being cheated out of their earnings in the South were complaining and grumbling, and they were getting ready to protest the government. And as it turns out, Joseph H. Jackson, realizing that, well, that's not going to get you anywhere, I'll tell you what we'll do. The National Baptist Convention is going to buy 400 acres of farmland in Tennessee, and you're able to work that farmland for free, rent-free, pocketing the money from your earnings, so that way you can then go out and buy your own farmland, so you're not beholden to a landlord. So these are the kind of practical things that Joseph H. Jackson would do. And he was the president of the National Baptist Convention. Martin Luther King and his contingent wanted to remove Jackson from the presidency of the convention and set up a man by the name of Gardner C. Taylor, who was a veteran minister in the convention who believed in the social gospel instead of the real gospel. The idea was to set Gardner Taylor up as a president so that Martin Luther King can come in after him as a young man and succeed him as a president. The church community overwhelmingly supported Jackson. He won in a landslide. Upset about the results of this election and demanding a roll call, King's contingent rushed into the convention, rushed the stage, and there was a kerfuffle on the stage. A man by the name of A.G. Wright, a minister out of Michigan, fell off the stage, cracked his head, and died. As a result of this, a committee voted King and his contingent out of the convention. They removed him from the convention. They would go on to start what was called the Progressive National Baptist Convention, which still exists today. This convention is an advocate of LGBT rights. They are an advocate of abortion and the whole nine. It's a apostate organization. So that is a kind of trail that king unfortunately left behind him. So he was fully aware of what he was doing. Joseph H. Jackson today is relegated to a footnote. Nobody knows who he is. Nobody knows the name. But you can read about him on pages like Wikipedia and then read about what I'm telling you right now. Yeah, it's unfortunate because thanks to the so-called victors, they say the victors are the ones who win in terms of writing our history books. Nobody knows who people like Joseph H. Jackson were. And here was a man, again, who believed in practical means of getting rid of Jim Crow, bringing people together, versus these agitative means that only causes more division and more friction. And when you look at the fact that we got a Civil Rights Act of 1964, there's a lot of people that believe that was good legislation, but the reality of it is it was negative legislation insofar that it traded one tyrant for another. The tyrant of the state, which dictated which door a Negro can and can't go out of, where you can and can't sit, and about, in the movie theater, so on and so forth, then gets replaced by the tyranny of the federal government, which says, regardless of, what you believe, you have to serve everybody. You have to hire people indiscriminate of whatever their race or ethnicity or whatever it is. Well, that infringes upon your free right to association. One of the things that I like about our founding fathers is that they had to basically undergo the difficult task of nation building while keeping in mind human nature, the way that man is wired, the way that man moves and operates. You can't rewire man, because to the extent that you attempt to do so, you're going to cause a bunch of friction and tension. And so what the founding fathers ingeniously did was, to the best of their ability, build a nation that has checks and balances and respect for your freedom of association and things of this nature, that to try to mitigate the kind of friction and tension that will naturally, inevitably happen in a nation as diverse as ours. And it's difficult to do, but I think that they gave us the best that they could. And so for King and his contingent to come later on and try to force, by way of legislation, people to love each other and get along, it's going to have an adverse effect. And I think we're seeing those adverse effects right now, more than we care to admit.
Really great presentation. I've always had problems with a lot of what Martin Luther King did, but you really keep just opening up my eyes. The white elephant in the room, how do I, as a white guy, talk about these things?
White elephant. That's such a dad joke. I think it's just about boldness, quite frankly. And then too, like the Bible says, I'm going to butcher this verse, but if we speak the truth but don't do so in love, we're nothing but a clanging gong or a cymbal. I forget exactly the word. I don't want to butcher it, but just make sure you're doing it in love, quite frankly. I mean, to tell the truth and do so in love, we have to be bold, especially as men. It's quite sad that the state of men, that's a side tangent that I want to go down. But anyway, I think that we have to be bold, and we have to do so with love. I love Dr. Martin Luther King. I really do. I was asked by Jason Whitlock, I went on his show a couple months ago, and he said, what do you think Martin Luther King would think about the kinds of things that you're saying right now if he were alive today? And so I don't know the answer to that question, Jason. One thing I will say, though, is that whenever I look at the parables of Jesus, and he talks about Lazarus and the rich man, and they died, and Lazarus went to paradise, and the rich man went to the place of torment, and there was a chasm that separated them. And the rich man he was, I guess he was thirsty, he wanted some water. He said, Father Abraham, send Lazarus over here to dip his hand in some water and let it drip onto my tongue. He said, well, I can't do that because there's a chasm between us. And he said, okay, well, let me go back and warn my brothers about this place of torment, that they change their ways and don't end up here. And Abraham said, well, no, they got the writings of the prophets. And if they're not going to believe that, what makes you think they're going to believe you? So when I look at this rich man who wanted so badly to come back and warn his brothers to change their ways, that they don't end up in this place of torment. I think of people like Martin Luther King, who, as we just saw, was living a very deceptive life. And we didn't even get into his private life, which is a whole other story, and it's actually quite sad. I mean, the requirements of being a minister of the gospel, of being a teacher in the church, are very high. And King wasn't living a moral life, even though he was considered to be the moral leader of the 21st century, or the 20th century. And as Dr. Carol Swain said in our trailer, if King was Mr., judge people by the content of their character and not the color of their skin, well, shouldn't we judge him by the content of his character, if that was his slogan? I think that's an important question to ask, but we mustn't be sensational for the sake of sensation. We mustn't be ugly for the sake of being ugly and causing trouble and causing friction. We mustn't do what the Marxists do. I believe that we can tell the truth and do so with love.
Thank you for your presentation. The Mid-South District has been looking at the nuclear traditional family. One of the things that we've stumbled across is a gentleman by the name of Dr. George Fraser. And one of his statements is that the economic disequity that is being experienced in the African American community in America is because of the lower marriage rate among the African American people, and it's startling information to take a look at that. Is that different than the social justice issue in the way that he's doing it, because he is criticizing the African American young men particularly for their low marriage rate? And here's the question that you wanted us to have: what can the church do about this?
That's a really fantastic question. Thank you for asking it. Well, I always say in my own little dad joke way that Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement took the Negro from a trying race to a crying race. And the reality of it is, prior to his rise and prior to the rhetoric that we began to see in during the Civil Rights Movement, it was such a distinction and such a difference from the kinds of things that Booker T. Washington and Joseph H. Jackson was talking about. Cast down your bucket where you are, put your hand to the plow. Nobody's going to give it to you. It's up to you. Joseph H. Jackson was famous for saying it's up to men to be men, irrespective of what your plight is, irrespective of what you were born into, what your conditions were. And again, we saw family formation was doing better amongst Blacks in many instances than it was with whites, depending on which region we were talking about. And so family formation was part and parcel of, I would say, American culture, but you saw it especially amongst Blacks. But as King would come along and he would talk about, the man in the MSNBC or NBC rather interview in 1967, I believe it was, he was sitting behind the Ebenezer pulpit, and he was asked about these kinds of things. And he would say that, well, men can't be men because of housing conditions and because of this and because of that. And so he was giving every excuse as to why men can't be men. Think about how embittering that is. Think about how deflating that is as a young Black man, to turn on the television and you see the person who is supposed to be the moral leader of our nation, who you're told is the leader of the Negro, telling you that men can't be men because of X, Y, and Z. As you move into the 70s, the age of indulgence, I call it, you have not only the Black militant movement that succeeded the Civil Rights Movement, you also have second wave feminism, you have gay liberation, which would later become the LGBT movement, you have free love, you have the hippie movement, you have a lot of these things that are going on, which is basically the baby boomers who are coming of age rebelling against their parents' generation, rebelling against the adult society. And as a result of this, you see a decrease in marriage rates. You see, and this was already happening. I mean, Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote about it, this trend, and he saw it in the 1950s, or the mid 50s, this kind of downward trajectory that was happening, which is around the same time that, King was kind of coming to the scene. I'm not laying it all at the feet of King. I'm just saying that this rhetoric this kind of shift in mindset, I think doesn't get as much attention paid to it as it ought to. If you're talking to Black liberals, they blame it on systemic racism. Talking to Black conservatives, they blame it on LBJ and the Great Society. Now, I tend to agree more with the conservative contingent than the leftist contingent. However, when it comes to LBJ and the Great Society, King was actually far more radical than LBJ. LBJ's Great Society did a lot of negative things in terms of social welfare, but King didn't believe that it went far enough. So he started what was called the Poor People's Campaign, which was meant to go further than the war on poverty. And so we let our hands off the proverbial plow, and we picked up the picket signs because we believe that those picket signs will get us the liberation we so desperately needed. We were interested in revolution as opposed to reformation. Reformation takes hard work, but in that hard work, there's a character building component. Whereas with your revolution, your sudden uprising is unsustainable and it will implode. You might get the facade of progress, but that progress will soon implode. And we're starting to see it. I mean, Dr. Carol Swain wrote about something similar, I think in 2005, where she saw the writing on the wall as this kind of emerging kind of fight back that we're seeing amongst, certain white folks. Because to the extent that you instill this kind of spirit of being a protected class into Blacks by way of the civil rights movement, what we saw happen as a result of this, in my opinion, I don't want to speak for anyone, but in my opinion, what we saw as a result of becoming a protected class by way of the civil rights movement is this kind of smug disposition amongst many Blacks, this kind of freedom to be openly racist, which we see in a lot of instances today among many Blacks. This kind of race paranoia, seeing racism where there is no racism, I think is one of the results. And for a long period of time, many whites have been in a mode of flight, walking on eggshells around Blacks so as not to offend. But now you're seeing a certain contingent of whites moving into an age of fight. They've had enough. And so you see people, some white people being openly racist, and especially if you're spending your time on X and places like that. I feel like I'm off on a tangent now, but anyway, your question really got all my my nerves going. But yeah, I mean, I think that the issue that we saw with Blacks in terms of being on this kind of upward trajectory, and then around the time of the civil rights movement plateauing, and then going on this rapid decline, is a result of a changing of the culture that exists not only amongst Blacks, we see it amongst whites too. But I think what we saw with the Black culture and the Black community was kind of the writing of the wall with what we would later see in America writ large. Anyway, so I have some papers that, if you're interested in either buying a pre-order of the DVD, we're still trying to raise money to finish it. The MLK Project, the docu-series. If you're interested, I would love to share that with you all.
You mentioned the Hegelian dialectic, and around the turn of the 20th century in Germany and Europe, there's a style of ideology called dialectical theology, which was a historically critical view of Christianity, that is to say, calling into doubt the historicity of the events in the Bible. And it seems to have, a lot of overlap with what you were presenting. Some of the big names in this are Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Did you see any kind of ideological ancestry here, a crossover inspiration in Martin Luther King's works and the things around him with that? Is that something you ran into?
Yeah. I mean, I did. And that's a whole story in itself. What was interesting, and hopefully this doesn't deviate too far from your question, but whenever Marx, a lot of people don't realize this, but Marx and Engels were actually contemporaries of Charles Spurgeon. They lived in London at the same time. Charles Darwin also lived in London at the same time as these men. And so at the same time that On the Origin of the Species is being published, the Communist Manifesto is being published, and you have Charles Spurgeon preaching the gospel at the Metropolitan Tabernacle there in London. And Spurgeon was hated by these men, as you can imagine. In fact, there was this game called Confessions that they would play in London in the middle part of the 19th century. And basically what it was a youngster would make a questionnaire and they would ask their friend questions from that questionnaire and they would jot down what the answer was. Karl Marx's daughter, Jenny Marx, did one for Friedrich Engels. And the answer to the question of the character you hate the most in this world, Engels put one word: Spurgeon. The reason he hated Spurgeon is because Marx and Engels wanted desperately to galvanize, to mobilize the urban poor. And Spurgeon was preaching the gospel, attracting people by the thousands from the urban poor to the very wealthy. And people were repenting and being born again. And so Marx and Engels had a very big problem with this. As you get into the latter part of the 19th century, they were trying to come up with more ways to try to get rid of this hurdle known as the gospel, to try to infiltrate it, to try to be. You had some who were very hostile in their attacking of Christianity, but by the time you get to the 1930s, under Earl Browder, who was a leader of the Communist Party in those days, they figured out that the best way to jump this hurdle is to infiltrate it and to implode it from within. And so as the decades pass, you get closer and closer to Martin Luther King, they would figure out more better ways to do just that. But Walter Rauschenbusch, he was a theologian out of Hell's Kitchen, New York, and he took a trip to London. And when he visited London, he was enamored of something called the Fabian Society. I'm sure you heard of the Fabian Society. And what he liked about the Fabian Society is that the Fabian Society was made up of intellectuals and elitists who agreed with Marx and agreed with Engels in terms of their identifying the issue and identifying the solution. Where they disagreed with Marx and Engels was on the basis of a fast-paced revolution. This kind of workers of the world unite, stand up and unite. Whereas the Fabian Society was more tactical and they were more patient and they were trying to figure out the dialectical way to jump this hurdle and to change the hegemony of society. They knew that they needed to undergo what was called a slow march through the institutions, which we would later see with the Frankfurt School in the 1940s at Columbia University. And they understood that maybe I might not live to see socialism reign in our country, but my great-grandchildren will. So they were very patient and willing to play the long game. Walter Rauschenbusch would come back to the United States and then pen his famous book, Christianity and the Social Crisis. And as I said earlier, that would be the kind of dialectic way, if you will, and that a lot of these liberal seminaries would teach. They would teach Marxism with this kind of Christian sophistry, if you will. So I don't know if I answered your question, and we can talk after if I didn't. So.
You talked about disruptions being staged to cause the state to not look capable, so the federal government would come in. This seems to relate to the Little Rock Nine. And so I was wondering if you could talk about, was this just another disruption to usurp power from the local people? Or is there a communist agenda to infiltrate our schools in particular with this event?
You all asked very good questions. Yes, it was an agenda. So the fact is, before the integration of schools, you had prayer in schools. You had a very Christian kind of aspect to the way children were being taught. I mean, even going back to the 18th and 19th century, the way that students would learn to read in a lot of regions would be by Bible reading. But as you get into the 20th century, more and more schools from the turn of the 20th century to the middle part of the 20th century were beginning to integrate. We're beginning to desegregate. This wasn't happening as a widespread thing, but it was happening in little pockets of the country. And for other schools, it wasn't even a question because it was a matter of proximity. because blacks were clustered in some areas and whites were clustered in other areas. And if a black were to go to a white school, you'd have to drive or go quite a distance to get there. And so it was just a matter of going to whatever was proximately close to you. But the Marxists were hell bent on making integration an issue, not because they genuinely cared about integration, but because they understood that if they were to win the fight of integration of the schools, what it will then do is give them the kind of upper hand in curriculum building. And when it comes to Marxism, centralization is the name of the game. If we can centralize education into being a state-controlled thing, then that gives us the ability to control future voters and to control mindsets and public opinion. These people don't study the social sciences, the cognitive sciences for no reason, just for the heck of it. They study it because they are very interested in shaping public opinion, for one, but also, two, engineering society, social engineering. And so that's one of the biggest reasons why they have an interest in the centralization of the schools. So when you look at the Little Rock Nine, when you look at all these things, they're kind of part of it. But it's also worth mentioning too that they were going around, they were lying to Black school students. An example of this, just very quickly, is Dr. King was having a very hard time getting his movement to really take off. And he would go around to different places that Stanley Levison was identifying, go to this place, go to that place. And they weren't able to make anything shake. For example, they went to Albany, Georgia, and they wanted to have a school integration kind of protest. But the police chief, understanding how Marxism works, understanding how agitation works, said, look, Martin Luther King and his contingent, they're going to come into our city and they're going to try to pull kids out of school and do a protest. We have to arrest them because even though in this country you have freedom of speech, we also are a country of law and order. And so if you're going to do a large demonstration like that, you have to pull a permit because we have to control for traffic, we have to control for noise, we have to do all the things. And so according to the law and the policies and so on, we have to arrest these people. However, once these jails are full to capacity, we have to utilize other means to disperse the crowds. That's the dogs, that's the hoses, that's, things like this, which, by the way, was a common practice, a common way of dispersing crowds in those days. I mean, I have video footage in the docu-series of them using these same tactics to disperse all white labor union crowds who are doing the same exact things in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. They're literally turning dogs and hoses on all white people. So it wasn't just a thing that they were doing to the Negroes. And so the police chief of Albany, Georgia said, I don't want to do that. I don't want to turn dogs and hoses on children. So what he did was he partnered with local towns and told them what was going to happen and when it was going to happen. And these other neighboring towns allowed the police chief to start turning people over to other jails whenever their jail filled to capacity. Well, apparently Bull Connor in Birmingham didn't get the message, didn't get the memo, because they went over to Birmingham, they pulled the kids out of school, and they would do so by telling a lot of the kids in Birmingham, they weren't really perplexed or anything by school, segregation or anything like that. By their own admission, I went through the files, I went through their reports and things of this nature. But what would happen was James Bevel, who worked for Dr. King, was allowed to go into the schools and show them propaganda videos to embitter them and enrage them so that they would be all the more enthusiastic to join the march. Another thing that they would do is tell the students that the reason why you have the hand-me-down books and the mismatched uniforms is because the whites administrators don't want you to have what they have. When the reality is, I looked into this too, and what you'll find is that in a lot of these states, like in Massachusetts, for example, and this is also true in Birmingham, the Black schools were actually getting more funding than the white schools. They were getting 70% of the funds that were allocated to schools, and the white schools are only getting 30%. The problem is that in some circumstances, the Negro school administrators were misappropriating the funds. And in other circumstances, and I think this is true, I think the latter part of this is more true than the former, depending on which schools we were talking about, you had Black school administrators who were just more thrifty. They wanted the money to stretch longer. And so rather than buying new books and uniforms, they would repurpose books and uniforms from the other schools. And so it wasn't a matter of, we're just going to give you hand-me-down books. They were trying to make the money like last longer and stretch it so that but Bevel and his contingent in King, they didn't care about that. All they cared about was using these kind of issues to say they don't care about you, and that's why they give you the hand-me-down books and things of this nature. The idea being to get these kids into the street. And so that worked like a charm. That's where you get the dogs. That's where you get the hoses. That's where you get the batons. And all of this went around the world by way of television and newspaper articles. And that's whenever John F. Kennedy introduced the civil rights legislation in 1963, shortly before his assassination. Now, as it turns out, the civil rights legislation was already on John F. Kennedy's desk. He just didn't want to introduce it yet. And the reason why he didn't want to introduce it yet was because there was a bitter debate going on in Congress over states' rights versus federal authority. And both sides of the debate had equal weight because they were both making very good points, just like they were during the ratification of the Constitution. But once you saw the dogs and the hoses, it was a lost fight for those arguing for states' rights, because now the states look incapable of self-governance. How dare Bull Connor do this? Even though, never mind, they tried it 15 different times in 15 different cities, but all it took was that one. Because to the extent that you can put that imagery out there, the public wants now for something to be done. Look at George Floyd, 2020. I mean, I've heard certain academicians call George Floyd 2020 the third Reconstruction, a means, a vehicle by which to unleash a plethora of policies off the back of George Floyd. So we're releasing a plethora of policies and DEI and private corporations and things of this nature that has nothing to do with George Floyd, but because this Negro had a knee to his neck, we have to do all these things and go out of our way to make things equitable. So according to them, after slavery is the first Reconstruction, King is a second Reconstruction, George Floyd is the third Reconstruction. It's all about friction and tension.
Well,
Sorry
the
for
more
these
things
long-winded
change,
answers, by
the
the way.
more they remain the same. And you see the same tactics being carried out today, George Floyd, all of that. And the reason I'm standing up here today is because Chad can't say these things, or he hasn't. The tremendous costs that he has paid just to get this far. And I can tell you that after Uncle Tom 2, I was in Uncle Tom 1, Uncle Tom 2, most, if not all, the Black conservatives my age were against this project. And we felt that, King was all we had to bring us together. We knew he had all of these flaws, but is this the right time to reveal this information? And I realized at some point that for me, I was one of the ones that talked Chad into delay the project some. Is that it's my own fear as far as what happens, if you take away King. But I came to the realization that truth, we need truth. And it's going to be some growing pains, and I don't know what will happen if the bill actually gets out, in the sense that there's so many people trying to suppress it already, and that Chad doesn't have the kind of support that he needs. And so if you believe in truth, and you want to help Chad to be able to make this truth available to the world, then he needs your support. Thank you.
Thank you all.